Hi, good morning, Valencia students, and welcome to our lecture number 15, where we're going to be looking at some elements of the third of the Abrahamic faiths that we'll be introducing in this class, the very oftentimes misunderstood faith of Islam. We'll try and understand something about the historic origin of how Islam developed, what the ideas of Islam were in its origins, how Islam has changed over time, and it's how it's going to help to build up a perception amongst Europeans of having a common enemy. Now let's look at some of these things to understand when Rome declined as a major power, of how Islam came forward as a new major mass movement, particularly one reaching out to the poor and to the marginalized. So, Islam, as the third of the Abrahamic faiths, rose up in an area we now know as Saudi Arabia, but which was known in ancient times simply as the Arabian Peninsula. And the geography of this, like most places, is going to have a huge impact upon the development of this particular faith and its expansion through many parts of the world. Much like Persia, when we spoke about Persia, we said one of the greatest challenges for the Persians was how little of their land was any good for agriculture. The Arabian Peninsula, it's even worse. There is not one single river in the entire peninsula. Only about 1% of the land is any good for agriculture, and it's really limited products that you can grow in these particular territories. What was completely dependent here for life to be able to exist all in the Arabian Peninsula was what's called a wadis. What a wadis is something that was once some type of form of what could have been a riverbed, if there were, water coming through. Areas that have dried up, but that still have a good firm hardness underneath. And luckily for the Arabian Peninsula is a certain season called monsoon season. So sort of in Florida here, we deal with things like hurricane season. Monsoon season in this region of the world brings through huge torrential rains for short periods, and you hope during those times that water will fill up in different areas and will create desert oases. So as you were traveling along the hot desert, and you can think of like stereotypes of this in the movie, like, oh, the desert, it's so hot. Is that a mirage I see out there? Is that an oasis? Is there some water? Most of those types of narratives originate from the experience of the Arabian Peninsula. But here's what's incredibly unique about it. For the fact that it's a peninsula, that on one side you have Africa, the other side of that peninsula you have Iran, or Persia, and to the south of that you have access to the Indian Sea, is that if people settled in areas around the coast, they could engage in elements of international trade of products, or a crossroad of ideas, and it will become the epicenter of the Islamic faith. The Islamic faith, we're going to look broadly from around the year 570 CE up to around the year 700 CE to look at not the 12 tribes of Israel, but a different 12 tribes who also came from Abraham, the 12 tribes of the Arab peoples. Now, here's the question. As this faith grows up from these very unique peoples who are also descendants of Abraham, why would Islam, more and more in the minds of so many who live in the West, we'll define more and more as Europe in the next week, why would they think of Islam as an enemy? Well, we can think about some elements of the faith, but let's take a look at a map here for a second. So, if we look at a map here for a moment, considering the influence and the spread of Islam, one of the reasons why Europeans are going to start thinking about Islam as something Eastern, different, separate, enemy, has less to do with elements of the religious faith itself. It has more to do with the fact that Rome was central to their identity, and the Roman Empire at its peak in height was 1.9 million square miles. With less than 100 years, a faith that started off in a small trading town called Mecca, and then moved over to this area called Medina, and then spread through here, and then went through here. Oh no, goodbye Byzantine Empire, half of you. Goodbye Persian Empire. Ah, heck, now that we've got the Middle East, let's go over here, and then over here, and then over here. And what do you mean up into Spain? Islam was a major force in continental Europe. Yes, indeed, for 700 years. So, how did all of this develop, and what is the story of the Prophet Muhammad? Peace and blessings be upon him. So, in the previous slide, why did I end with the phrase, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him? That was out of a sign of cultural respect. While I myself am not a practitioner of the Islamic faith, I've had the great honor 3 different times in my life of having Muslim roommates, one from Afghanistan, one from Pakistan, and one from Palestine. And that time to have all sorts of wonderful conversations and to witness somebody in the practice of their faith, not based upon stereotypes you see on the cable news and all these things, but one-on-one. And the aspect that struck me the most with it is oftentimes the word Islam. If we hear Islam in our modern minds, we think violence, we think war. Now, we need to understand something about the word Islam. Islam in Arabic means to submit. So before I knew any Muslims, like, oh, Islam, well, that's where you have to submit to every single thing, and it's about controlling your life, and they all corrected me on this. They said, it's to submit in a way of letting go and understanding the true nature of God, and to submit to the peace that God grants through his love and through his mercy. I was like, well, that's not how I ever heard it. As I said, okay, the root word of Islam, as the root element of that, is the word Islam. In Arabic, that means peace. So if you ever hear somebody say salam shalom, that is reference that's saying peace be with you in both Hebrew as well as in Arabic. So how is a faith that we associate in our mind oftentimes as conflict and violence, where did that come from when the central word of the faith is peace? So let's talk a little bit here about Muhammad ibn. Muhammad ibn was born in the Arabian city of Mecca around the year 570 CE, and he led a heartbreaking childhood. Just before Muhammad was born, his father died, so Muhammad never knew his father. When he was 7 years old, his mother died. He was a person who knew something very deeply about loss. But after his mother died, he was sent off to live with a wealthy uncle there in Mecca. His uncle was a merchant who sold different idols and trinkets of different polytheistic gods, because people would come to Mecca on a regular basis, because there in the middle of the city was this huge black structure called the Kaaba. Now, the Kaaba, according to Islamic tradition, was first built by Adam and Eve when they were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and that it was the first place created as a place of worship to the one true God. They believe the original Kaaba was destroyed during the flood of Noah's time, and then was rebuilt by Abraham with his son Ishmael. And Ishmael is the great patriarch of the Arabic tribes. During this time, though, the Kaaba was utilized by people of all sorts of different faiths, and this always bothered Muhammad greatly, because he saw people making money from religion, and he saw people practicing all sorts of different religions, and he was well aware of different elements of Judaism and Christianity. There were Jews and Christians throughout the Arabian Peninsula, and polytheism just always bothered him. And what was a consistent thing as an adult life is there was a cave just outside of Mecca, a place called Mount Hira. And he would go there on a regular basis to get away from the ruckus of the city, and he'd go there to meditate and to pray. And when Muhammad was 40 years old, there was one evening he spent the entire evening in the cave praying and meditating, because all sorts of things about injustice and inequality were bothering him. And as the sun was rising, the sun started shining in the cave that morning, as the light was even brighter than usual, and stepping out of the light came an angel. But not just any angel. If you know anything about biblical stories, a very specific angel of the God Jehovah, or Allah, which is simply the Arabic word for God in reference to the same God of Abraham, the angel Gabriel. The angel Gabriel, in all of these stories of all of the prophets, is always the messenger of God. If God has something important to share, as he shares it through Gabriel. So, what Gabriel shared with the with Muhammad. They said, "You are the final prophet of God." Said, traditionally, prophecy has been gone down through the other side of Abraham's family, through Jacob and his descendants, who are descendants of Isaac. Said, but your side, coming from Ishmael, also has the gift of prophethood. Said, I am going to get you to put together a new holy book. And Muhammad's very confused by this. He said, Muhammad is illiterate. He said, I can't read and write. What do you mean you need me to write a book? And he said, the way we'll do this is, said, I will write the words on your heart spiritually. And after prayer, when you open your mouth to speak, is that these will be the direct words of Allah coming out from your mouth. And you need to have somebody to start writing these down and to call it the Holy Quran. He said, because there has been something that has been profoundly shifted when it comes down to the Abrahamic faiths. As he said, Isa, or Jesus, peace and blessings be upon him, was the greatest prophet that God had ever sent. But that the message had gotten messed up because humans had told the stories. They didn't write them down at the time. They told the stories, and they got translated from this language to that language to that language, and only 4 canonical gospels, a whole lot of other things thrown out. As they said, Gabriel claimed to Muhammad, he said Jesus was not God. That would make elements of polytheism. He said there is only one God, that is Allah. Only one deity, that is God, Allah. Jesus was God's greatest prophet to give a profound message to the poor and the oppressed. Said, but this message has gotten messed up because now it's become the message of the Roman ruling class. Says, you need to correct this. I will write the words upon your heart. When you speak them out, have somebody write them down, and you will be the final prophet of God to give God's revelation that Jesus is not God, that Jesus, according to Gabriel, was not an intermediary to forgive the sins of the world, that the important role that the prophet Jesus would have would be there for the final day of judgment. But it is Allah who grants salvation to all who are righteous most mercifully, and that this restoration of a gospel to the poor and the oppressed is what Muhammad needs to bring forward. So, after being visited by an angel, what's a 40-year-old orphan kid to do? Welcome to the birth of Islam. So, Muslims, how are they supposed to interact with Christians, and what was the original point of the message of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was that Muslims refer to Jews and Christians as fellow people of the book. They say we have the same prophets, we have the same stories, we have the same God. It's just we have a little bit of a different twist on the traditions because our words about these great prophets come directly from God, and that they were written down in the Quran, and the Quran is only supposed to be in Arabic, and therefore there's never problems with the translations, things getting lost in translation, oral stories going down for hundreds of years. So when you read something like the Quran, as it tells the stories of the different prophets, but oftentimes just as a bit of a different twist. And so they, of course, they use the Arabic names for these people. So Abraham is referred to as Ibrahim. Moses is referred to as Musa. King David is Dawood. Jesus is Isa, which is simply the Arabic name for Jesus. And Muhammad. Muhammad is not a character in the Quran. Muhammad is simply the one who speaks the words of the Quran, and his son-in-law wrote the words down in Arabic. So the story of this is, as they say, that Abraham received the first revelations, and then the story of prophethood went down through the line of Isaac, but that the covenant with Abraham's descendants also went through Ishmael's line as well, and that Ishmael would bring forward the final prophet, Muhammad. So Abraham got the first revelations, Moses started recording God's law, King David showed how to unite a holy people through a righteous leader who could inspire a sense of unity and to create a kingdom that was based upon following the laws of the one true God. And then the great prophet Jesus, peace and blessings be upon him, was brought forward to teach humanity the full mysteries and the extent of Allah's compassion, love, and mercy. So, according to the traditions, and people always think it's a little bit weird, but look, the name that is mentioned the most in the entirety of the Holy Quran is the name Jesus. It tells many stories about Jesus there within the Quran. What it does, though, is it just gives a little bit of a different twist on things. So, for instance, the story of the birth of Jesus is talked about in the Quran, but a little bit of a different twist. The way that people understood that Jesus was important and special according to the stories in the Quran was that just after his birth, is that people were standing around and asking questions. How do we know that this is the Jesus Christ, this is the anointed one, all these different things, is that according to the stories in the Quran, is that Jesus sat up in his crib and announced, I am the prophet Jesus, sent by the one true God, Allah, to teach you about compassion, love, mercy. Now that we all got that straight, I'm going to sit back down, because I'm a baby, and people are like, the baby just talked. I guess that's a sign that he's important. So, things like that. So, based upon this, is that what most Muslims lay out in how the practice of faith is supposed to go is about trying to bring about peace and unity between the fellow people of the book. And that one would hope to inspire Christians and Jews to come over to the Islamic practice by leading a very good and righteous life. So, for instance, one of my Palestinian roommate, he was a professional mechanic back in Utah. I had a huge project that I needed to get done on my car. I'm not a mechanic, and I couldn't afford it. I could afford to go get the parts, and I came home one night, and I had been out in the garage. I'm working, I can't get anything done. And he didn't even say, can I help, as he just walked over, and he took the tools, and he started doing all the things himself. And he worked on it for about 4 hours. He got the project all done. As I tried to offer him some money, and he said, "I can't take your money." I said, "But you did all this work for me." And he said, "Allah granted me a gift of talent of being a mechanic, and I have this wonderful, mysterious opportunity called life to share my skills freely with people." And I said, and you as my roommate, my brother, you are in need. So of course I stop by and drop everything, and I help you, and I ask for nothing in return. I was like, is that because Jesus inspires you to do stuff like that? And he said, yes. I'm like, oh. He said that this is how we share them. He's like, we don't talk about Jesus that often in our faith. He said, we've tried to practice lives inspired by the message of Jesus, and have Christians and Jews say, why do you do that? Like, because Jesus taught us to. Like, well, that's an interesting way of approaching things. Now, here's the crux and the problem with it all, is the final book of the Christian New Testament, the book of Revelation. It talks about a final days. It talks about a great battle between Christ and between the Antichrist. It talks about a false prophet, that this false prophet will come forward with a message to confuse humanity, that the false prophet will talk about peace and a new order to the world, and that this is all a trick from the devil. And here's one of the problems. The first times that Christians start encountering aspects of Islam and Muslims saying that they've come in peace, fellow people of the book, is the Christian interpretation for a very long time in Europe is going to say that Muhammad is the false prophet that was talked about in the book of Revelation, and that the followers of Muhammad are part of the larger rising armies of the Antichrist, and that your duty as a Christian is to go to war against the armies of the Antichrist. We'll talk about how that unfolded over the next week or so here. So, perhaps not a big surprise, when one has gone off to a cave and one is talked to by the angel of Gabriel, is one would like to talk with people about this, but one might be a little bit shy about this at first. So the initial people who are going to be involved in the faith of Islam, and they are going to embrace Muhammad as a prophet and start getting involved with elements of his ministry are going to be his family. The first ever convert to the Islamic faith will be his future son-in-law, Ali. Ali at this time was only 9 years old. Muhammad came back after talking with the angel Gabriel. He was telling his wife about it, and Muhammad's wife, well, she's trying. Okay, dear, you were talking to the angel Gabriel. Oh, you're the final prophet. Oh, you're supposed to write a book. Okay, and Ali said, I believe you. He said, how do I profess this? And it became the step. If one wants to become a Muslim, all one has to do is say a simple phrase. There is no divine power but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. Ali said that, and he became the first Muslim. And it's Ali's task after that is that as Muhammad would speak the words that were written upon his heart, is that Ali was literate, and Ali would write the things down. He is going to be the first scribe of the Holy Quran. Now, after building up a small group of family, after a couple of years, as Muhammad started speaking and ministering in the streets of Mecca, and he became highly, highly unpopular with the wealthy and the elite, because he said that monotheism, that polytheism cannot be tolerated in any way, shape, or form, and that the message of Allah is to build up a community, what he referred to as the Ummah, and it was the solemn duty of all people to take care of each other, that to keep wealth for yourself was itself a sin, to oppress fellow people, to look the other way when one sees suffering, that all of these things were sins. And the wealthy said that he's preaching to the poor, and he's preaching in a very similar way that Jesus had as well. And there might be some ramifications to this. What solidified the following of the Prophet Muhammad, though, was in the year 620 CE. He had some great challenges. There had been some famines going on. It was a very hard time in the Arabian Peninsula, and his first wife died. His uncle died. And according to Muslim tradition, one evening is that the angel Gabriel showed up with, some have described as a flying horse, some have described it grand like a dragon, had Muhammad get upon this there in Mecca, flew Muhammad to the holy city of Jerusalem, and there where Muhammad landed, according to the Islamic tradition, is that there Muhammad was greeted by Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, and the three great Jewish prophets taught Muhammad the correct way to pray, and that he prayed together with the prophets there. The place where that happened, now there's a place in Jerusalem called the Dome of the Rock. That is supposed to be where Muhammad had met Jesus and where he learned how to pray properly. After that, Gabriel had Muhammad get back up on the steed, and the steed flew Muhammad up into heaven to meet Allah and to fly with the angels. And when he returned from this journey, when stories then circulated that not only had he met these great prophets, but that he had literally flown a flying horse up into the heavens to meet Allah face to face, is a lot of people were won over to the faith. And the wealthy of Mecca said, we have to stop this man, we have to stop him now, he's reaching out to the poor, he has a new message, kill him. Luckily, Muhammad had heard about these assassination attempts that were going to happen on him, and he fled the city of Mecca in a period that is known as Hujrah, where he fled to the city of Medina, which is about 100 miles away. There in Medina, there had been a period of strife, some potential threats of civil war about to break out, and Muhammad stepped in and he brought peace to the community. And there within Medina, as he built up the very first Muslim community called the Ummah, he started sending missionaries out from Medina across the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula, spreading this word about a a new profound way of approaching elements of the world, and wealthy from Mecca kept trying to attack Muhammad and his followers for a period of almost a decade, major military battles going on. But more and more, as the wealthy kept trying to crush this movement out, is that missionaries would bring more and more poor people in, who found within Islam a faith that resonated with them and that gave them hope. And after building up a large army of religious followers, as well as soldiers, is in the year 630 CE, the Prophet Muhammad returned to Mecca without bloodshed, and that he went to the Kaaba, had the Kaaba rededicated to Allah, said any elements of polytheism in this town are now banned. There is only one God, and that is Allah. This Kaaba was created by the very first humans as a place for praise to the one true God, and that this is now what it will be rededicated to. And 2 years later, he suddenly died. Muhammad did not have any sons. He had multiple wives, but all he ever had was daughters. But he had a son-in-law, Ali, who was incredibly close to him. But in just this very short period, the faith starts in the year 610 CE. By the time of his death, 22 years later, instead of saying a small, isolated group, it had spread across the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula, taking their people and giving them a commonality of both a religious structure as well as a political structure. So, but without somebody to then inherit these elements of leadership, what was the Muslim community of the Ummah supposed to do? So let me turn off. So for the next 2 slides, I'm going to give you just a basic crash course in theology about the practice of the faith of Islam. What are the basic beliefs and how does one practice the faith of Islam? And Islam centers on the idea of Allah's mercy. First and foremost, one has to accept that there is no other deity but Allah. There is just the one true God, and that they must reject all elements of polytheistic faiths, which also means a certain element of intolerance towards the other polytheistic faiths, which will cause problems over time. Number 2, one has to have a sincere belief in the role of angels in human life. The angels can assist us, angels are there to help and to guide us, and it's central to all of it is that one has to believe in angels to be a Muslim, because one has to believe that the angel Gabriel was God's divine messenger and wrote the Quran upon Muhammad's heart. One is also supposed to accept both the Bible as well as the Arabic Quran, is that there are according to Muslims, there are truths and important stories that are there within that particular text of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's just that some of the truths have been shifted and corrupted by the men who wrote the things down, who translated into different languages, and the groups who chose of what stories to include and what stories to exclude. So one is supposed to rely on the idea that the words of the Quran are directly the words of Allah, spoken through Gabriel onto Muhammad's heart, and that the other holy texts of the Abrahamic faiths are also highly important, and they need to be protected and they need to be learned from, but also to be a little bit critical of some of them. A supreme belief that they share with Christians is the idea of a future day of judgment, and that Jesus will be the one who plays the ultimate role on the day of judgment. That the role of Jesus would be to play the role of a supreme mediator, to judge people's goodness by being able to see right there into their heart upon their good works, and to cast away those who are wicked and evil into eternal condemnation. But along with this is based within the aspects of Islamic faith is that once somebody realizes how freely Allah shares his love and his mercy, that those who choose to do good and to live righteous lives will be given eternal paradise and to live at one with Allah for all of time. And that this is not something set aside just for people who are Muslim. This is something that is there for all of humanity. It's just that what it means to be a Muslim is a practitioner of the Islamic faith, that one has recognized the great love of God, is that one chooses to submit to that peace and to follow the basic tenets that God has laid out, and to try to lead a good and righteous and holy life of repentance when we have done something wrong, which translates to the next slide of the 5 pillars of Islam. So, one of the things that is unique about Islam and compared to the other 2 Abrahamic faiths is the process of conversion. Most of the other Abrahamic faiths, you have to go through certain classes. If you want to become Jewish, you have to learn to read Hebrew, you have to study scriptures, all sorts of things. Myself, growing up in a Lutheran church, I had to go through multiple years of what they called catechism classes before I could be a full and active member of the church, all these different things. To become a Muslim is what is called the Shahada, a declaration of faith. All one has to do is say, there is no deity but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. And ta-da, you are immediately a Muslim, according to this, which means missionaries have it pretty easy when they go out and they talk with other people. They just have to get them to say that phrase, and if if you say the phrase with sincerity, then you are automatically a Muslim at that point. But once somebody becomes a Muslim, there are certain expectations of you, particularly to participate in what is called the Salah. What you're supposed to do is to pray 5 different times a day. You're supposed to, and it's at very set specific times. So you pray right at the sunrise, you pray right at the sunset, and then 3 different prayers throughout the day. And it's expectation that if you have time during that, is that you have a certain prayer rug or cloth that you carry with you at all times, and you stop everything you're doing, and there are certain prayers that you say, and you get down on your rug, and you bend down, and point yourself towards the holy city of Mecca. In those times of prayer, one has a direct link with Allah. And if one is living in a larger Muslim community, it's hoped and expected that you all come together for these times of prayer. And in Muslim majority countries, that we'll see in this next clip, there's a thing called the call to prayer, where people get up on loudspeakers, they sing and recite certain parts, and that then leads people to know it is time for prayer. And something else to understand about the Quran, and it's part of the reason why it is supposed to stay in Arabic, is that the words of the Quran, if spoken in Arabic, and if you know Arabic, is it flows with a poetic prose. It's like a song all in itself. And that's part of the belief for Muslims, that these are actually directly the words of God, as they assume that if God was speaking right through a text, that God would say it in beautiful ways. And that's part for those who can read Arabic and can read the Quran in Arabic, is that, yeah, it comes off as a beautiful poetic prose. But it's not just about prayer. Along with this is the practice of zakat, or one could say almsgiving. Most organized religions will have some type of element. People oftentimes call it tithing, where you set aside a certain percentage of your own personal money to help with the functioning of the church. Zakat is different. Every Muslim who can afford to has to set aside 2.5% of their annual income to give directly for the assistance of the poor and to try to bring an end to inequality. And so there's something financially built into it, is that one is Muslim and living in a predominantly Muslim community, is that community, as a fellow child of God, that community is supposed to be dedicated to taking care of you. One of the other highly intriguing things of Islam, the practice of Sawm, or fasting, is that the Muslims have 1 month, and it changes every year because they do it based upon elements of a lunar calendar, the holy month of Ramadan. During that time, if one is a Muslim, from sunrise to sunset, one is supposed to fast. So no drinking, no eating, you are supposed to speak with a very pure tongue the entire time. If you're a smoker or anything like that, you're not supposed to smoke during Ramadan during the day. But as soon as the sun goes down, communities come together, they praise together, and they eat together, and that one is supposed to use that month of Ramadan to purify oneself every year, and to rededicate yourself in your community to living the type of life that Allah would expect. And the final aspect of the 5 pillars is one that It's not, you don't have to, but if you have the ability to, it's highly recommended. What is called the Hajj, or a pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, to partake in a certain ceremony around the Kaaba, since Muslims believe that the Kaaba was the very first religious place for religious practice ever built by human beings, by Adam and Eve, that as a devout Muslim, one would want to go and to participate in the Hajj at least one time in your life, to come together as a community of people from all around the world to work together in a certain ceremony. So this next clip, there was a very famous folk singer in the 60s and 70s named Cat Stevens. Wrote famous songs like Peace Train, Father and Son, all these things. Cat Stevens in the late 1970s dropped his entire musical career for almost 15 years, and he converted to Islam. He now goes by the name Yusuf Islam. He gave up his entire multi-million-dollar career. He was one of the most famous superstars on planet Earth, stepped away from all of it, and became a devout Muslim. He's relaunched his career in the last 2 decades as Yusuf Islam and goes on tours and things like that. This is Yusuf Islam doing the Muslim call to prayer, and it is images of people centered around the Kaaba, all participating in the Hajj. And the reason why I use this is that, I had a unique opportunity a number of years ago. Is for a while I was email pen pals with Yusuf Islam. I was running a whole speaker series called the Great Faith series, and the person I had come speak about Islam had been Cat Stevens' college roommate, who had given Cat his very first copy of the Quran. I was like, are you and Yusuf still friends? And he's like, yeah. Like, can I have his email? And he's like, yes, I will let you have his email. And so, yeah, for about a year, Yusuf Islam and I correspond on email for quite a bit. And he helped me to have a better understanding about this faith. So this next clip, if you want to, it's only about 2 minutes. It's the call to prayer. You will see people going around the Kaaba, but to get a more visual look at what things are like in the practice of Islam.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
Now, one of the great challenges of understanding the current ramifications of Islam in the 21st century is to understand the old heritage and tradition of what is called the Caliphate. Is that Muslims believe that if one is a Muslim, no matter where one lived on planet Earth, you were part of a larger community of the faithful, and that when you lived in areas that were predominantly Muslim, is they didn't really believe in elements of a separation of church and state. They said that God has given us certain laws, and that governments should be set up based upon these elements of God's law, and that we should have political leaders who are also spiritual leaders. So since the Prophet Muhammad died very quickly and abruptly, what do we do to bring somebody else forward? Is it leaders of the different Arab tribes who had converted to Islam? They came together and they democratically elected a new leadership, which was unique in aspects of terms of religious tradition, because usually some type of leadership would get passed down to the son. Muhammad did not have any sons, but he had a very close son-in-law who he had helped to raise since the age of 5, who had also been the first convert to Islam. He had been the one who wrote down the Quran. So many people said, well, of course, Ali will be the first caliph. And the people who elected did not elect Ali. Instead, they elected Muhammad's father-in-law, Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr, shown in this image here, and you'll notice there are never any images of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, because unlike the traditions of Jesus, where the icon of Jesus was put up all of the time, is Muslims said, well, you're praising Jesus as if he was God. Muhammad said, when I die, I don't want that same type of iconography, so if you ever see a picture of Muhammad, there will never be a face to it. The face will be covered. That is out of respect and reverence for the Prophet's wishes. But Abu Bakr, it was a very easy transition at first because, he had been one of the first Muslims. He was Muhammad's father-in-law. They were very close, and he emulated Muhammad's life and his teachings. It was a very easy transition, but the problem was Abu Bakr was old. So after just a couple of years, Abu Bakr died. The Arab leaders got together. They elected somebody else, Omar ibn al-Khattab. Omar was known as a man with a great sense of justice and a deep reverence for a message of social justice attached with Islam, as he saw Islam as a liberating theology for the poor. So, one of the techniques that Omar perfected, and it's why Islam was able to spread so rapidly over such a huge thing, is that before his armies would go to battle and to take over different areas, is they would send missionaries through first. And the missionaries, very simple thing. As I said, if you want to convert to Islam, all you have to do is say this phrase. Because one of the things to keep in mind with this is that traditionally, if two groups go to battle as whatever side wins, is they have the ability to enslave whoever they have just conquered. A Muslim cannot take a fellow Muslim into slavery. So, like, okay, so if I convert to Islam before the armies get here, and particularly if I'm a poor person, number one, the community will have to take care of me. So the wealthy and elite are scared to death of this because like, oh no, because they're going to make us have to take care of poor people and all these different things. There's a social justice message. But here's the thing. When the missionaries would come and they would speak to the poor, is the wealthy and the elite had a very hard time finding people who would fight on their behalf when the Muslim armies would start coming through. A whole lot of the battles that went forward in terms of military conquests, the Muslim armies kept growing larger and larger and larger, getting more and more converts, and a lot of times battles wouldn't even happen because if you're facing an overwhelming foe and your own people are supportive of the message of a social justice message, a lot of people surrender quickly. Now here's the most important part about Omar. First and foremost, the Byzantine Empire, he's going to push the Romans out of areas of Egypt, out of areas of Palestine. He's going to push them north into what we now call Turkey. He's going to shrink down. Essentially, Romans will no longer have a major presence in the Middle East, and he's able to conquer the entirety of the Persian Empire. But here's the complicated part, is that Muslims took over the holy city of Jerusalem, because for them, the city of Mecca is the most holy, and the city of Jerusalem is the second most holy, because Jesus is also central to their faith. And a decision was made by Omar that lasted for several hundred years after this, was that the city would be shared equally by Christians as well as Jews. The Byzantines, as legacies of the Romans, had seen the Jews as an enemy, and Jews weren't allowed to go to Jerusalem or to even live in these territories. As Omar says, Jews, you are welcome to come back. You can live in peace, and you can praise here, and we will share the holy city. And Christians, as long as you respect as fellow people of the book, then you too can share. We will share the holy city together. So all of a sudden, Arabs and Islam came to define the Middle East instead of Romans defining, or Greeks defining, or Persians defining. And that's something important to keep in mind. As a huge, well, the vast majority of Iranian people are Muslim. Iranian people are not Arab. It's just that Arabs have been a dominant force in the Middle East ever since this, because the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, were Arab, and those who spread the Islamic faith initially were almost exclusively from the Arab tribes. But now all of a sudden we start having one of the major Abrahamic faiths becoming the dominant political and religious movement of almost the entirety of the Middle East, as well as parts of northern Africa. So, when the second caliph died, many people assumed, okay, the Arab leaders, they're going to elect Ali. And they didn't elect Ali. They elected Uthman bin Affan instead. And Ali simply came on as a major spiritual advisor for Uthman. What Uthman is going to do is he's going to expand out Muslim presence out of the Middle East, across the entirety of northern Africa, all the way up into Spain, essentially taking over half of the Mediterranean. And as Muslims went forward, one of the things that they set up in all sorts of different areas is they said the Quran, it is important to get this message out here. So they start encouraging people to learn to read Arabic, and they would have copies of the Quran, a master copy, placed in every major city that they had taken over, and the ability for those who wanted to learn Arabic and who wanted to be able to have verses from the Quran to study themselves is that once you would learn Arabic is you could come to this copy of the master copy and copy down verses to take it home, or copy the entire thing, but you have to keep it in Arabic. It's only in recent decades that people have allowed any real translation of the Quran into other things, and that has to do with more of events of post-September 11th, of trying to let people, okay, here's what the Quran actually says about these different things, and people going, oh, okay. But it's also important to understand is that the vast majority of Muslims in the modern world today do not live in the Middle East, is they live in Southeast Asia, what we now call Indonesia. That's where the majority of Muslims live, and the language, predominant language there, is not Arabic. But people who want to be able to read the Quran themselves will learn Arabic to be able to read it in the original language. But all of a sudden, they expand out presence, and Uthman is going to take the ideas of Omar and extend them even further, and to encourage Jewish people to come to settle in areas that have been conquered by the Muslims, and to say, we will offer you protection, that we're both peoples of the book, we're both descendants of Abraham, and we're reuniting the family. And everywhere you've gone so far, people have tried to kill you off, people have tried to murder you. You are now safe and protected. When that's one of the things, oftentimes we think in modern times, we think, oh, Muslims and Jews, they never get along. That's only since mid-1930s. Prior to that, up until the 1930s, wherever Muslims and Jews settled together, is they always got along fantastically. It was Christians that they had issues with. Now here's the problem. There were many people who had been supporters of Ali who were horribly upset that Uthman had become the third caliph and not Ali, and their solution for it is they broke into Uthman's home in the middle of the night, set it on fire. They found him in his back room praying, and they murdered him in cold blood. And to try to prevent some type of civil war from breaking out, as the Arab leaders this time elected Ali. They said, Ali, you are the closest living member of Muhammad's family. Since you lived with Muhammad since you were 5, since you were the very first Muslim, since you were the one who wrote down the Quran, is we will trust you with leadership. But then people started asking, because Ali had sons. They said, okay, so once Ali dies, will Ali's sons take place? Will things go down through the family line? These people will be referred to as Shia Muslims. They have a distinct brand of the way they practice the Islamic faith and with their interpretation of Ali. And Ali took Muhammad's words very, very seriously about aspects of wealth being a corrupting factor. So Ali at this point ruled over the largest empire on planet Earth. 4.5 million square miles, which meant he had access to all sorts of wealth. And he gave it all away, starting to practice a form of what one could say an element of Islamic socialism. The reason why I say it's socialism is that it's government redistribution of wealth. Ali emptied the entire treasury and distributed it evenly to every single one of his subjects across the entirety of his empire, and said, this is how we are supposed to practice Islam. But there were also others who were wealthy, who had converted to the Islamic faith, who didn't like this sort of radicalism of empowering the poor, taking care of the poor, and they had Ali murdered. When Ali was in a mosque leading prayer, in the middle of the prayer is stabbed in cold blood in the front of the congregation while leading prayer. And people who had identified with the idea that Ali and descendants of Ali should not be in charge, they are called Sunni Muslims. Most of them are based out of Saudi Arabia in modern days. And the followers of Ali are Shia Muslims. Most of them are based out of places we now know as Iran and Iraq. And these constant civil wars that we still see going on in the Middle East are still a product very much of that Sunni and Shia split. And people, ever since European powers were no longer officially in charge of the Middle East, of trying to rebuild the old days of having a caliph in charge of these entire territories. So, now, the year 661 AD, we've got Sunni, we've got Shia, and we've got 4.5 million square miles. Will things last? So, I appreciate those of you who have taken the time to watch the entirety of this, because even though it's a course on Western Civ, is usually stuff with Islam is associated with world history, or Eastern Civ. But to understand what Western Civ is, we need to understand that Western Civ oftentimes defines itself as trying to be the opposite of something. And it's the Westerners who start defining what is or is not Western. And what we're going to see is more and more what people define as Western means that you live north of the Mediterranean in a place called Europe. And if you live east of that or south of that, you are part of Eastern civilization. The great tragedy of aspects of Islam, though, is many aspects of Islam were about trying to bring an element of peace and unity between the Abrahamic faiths and fellow people of the book. And the legacies of that are going to be very convoluted and complicated and controversial. But a long-lasting legacy, as we'll see after the rise of Islam, is that polytheism is going to start declining in prominence throughout the world. The vast majority of people in the world now who practice any type of religious faith, it's usually one of the monotheistic faiths, and usually one of the monotheistic faiths based out of the Abrahamic traditions. Now, what's important, though, is also that Jesus will become the central figure of defining the different faiths. All of them believe in the same God, but all three of them interpret Jesus differently. So once again, if you're a Jew, you believe, well, Jesus, he was just a radical rabbi. He got killed off by the Romans. End of story. If you're a Christian, you believe that he was the Messiah, that he was crucified, resurrected, and that this was evidence that he was God and that he is the gateway for the forgiveness of sins. And Muslims saying, you've got the story wrong. Muslims don't believe that Jesus was actually crucified. They believe that he was arrested, and when it came time for the crucifixion, they found somebody who looked very similar to him, and that person was crucified, and then instead, God then raised Jesus in full, alive, in human form, up into heaven. So, going forward with this, as they say, Jesus will be there on the judgment day, but he's not the gateway for salvation. He was simply God's greatest messenger to talk about compassion and love, and that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was here to try to clarify the historic teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And what we're also going to see is, for a very long period, a sense of Abrahamic unity between the tribes of Abraham with Isaac and with Ishmael. Jews and Muslims, in terms of the way they practice their faith, they've got a whole lot of aspects of similarities. They're both very strict about following the different laws of Moses. They are both people centered in on aspects of certain elements of ritual, and for both of them, there's not an element of a person who is a gateway for a forgiver of sins, that they are practitioners that one has to live one's own life in a good and holy way, and that this is how one is granted gifts of compassion and love from God. Along with this is that Muslims are also going to offer Jews protection. For the next 700 years, an area known as Spain in modern times will be ruled over by Muslims and Jews living together in peace. It's oftentimes in history referred to as the Golden Age of Spain. At the very end of our class, we'll bring an end to the Golden Age of Spain when it is reconquered by people we call conquistadors. And in 1492, just before Columbus sails the ocean blue, this is when Ferdinand and Isabel had finally conquered Spain in the name of the Roman Catholic Church, and they put forward a declaration saying that all Jews had 1 year to get out of Spain, or else they would all be murdered. And who saved the Jews? Was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, sent his entire royal fleet across the Mediterranean Sea to save the Jews of Spain from being murdered. We'll get to that later on. And that's part of the problem, is what's going to be pivotal within a concept of a European identity as we get into elements of studying medieval European society. They're going to pivot around a phenomenon, a series of wars that last a couple hundred years called the Crusades, where the Roman Catholic Church are going to define, they're going to say that Muslims are followers of the false prophet that was talked about in the aspects of the book of Revelation, and that they are part of the rising armies of the Antichrist, and that Jews killed Jesus, and that they were responsible for unleashing elements of evil, and that Muslims and Jews were co-conspirators in evil, and it was up to Christians to reconquer the Holy Land, to take Jerusalem, and to define European identity is what it meant to be Christian for well over 1,000 years in Europe, was that you perceived that the source of evil in the world were Muslims and Jews, and that they were literally, in many Christians' minds, agents of the devil. Welcome to the historic legacies of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all sorts of things, but we'll see over the next couple of weeks if we can sort through some of those very complicated things. Anyways, thank you. I realize some of my lectures are getting longer lately. I'll try to shorten them down. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this, and have a good day.